This is Dr. Ted Hildebrandt in his New Testament History, Literature, and Theology course, lecture number 16, on the source theories in the Synoptic Problem and form criticism and solutions to the Synoptic Problem, and then proceeding into an introduction to the book of John. Well, welcome back. Last time we were talking, we finished up the book of Luke on prayer with the tax collector and the Pharisee and the persistent widow, the two parables on prayer. Then we jumped into the Synoptic Problem, and we've been looking at some of the similarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are the three synoptic gospels. And John, we showed that John was very, very different. 92% of John is unique material, whereas only 7% of Mark is unique material. And so we were talking about some of the synoptic problems, places where there's different order, where there's different wording, where there seems to be conflict and stuff. And so we were discussing some of the conflicts, which is called the Synoptic Problem, very famous. Now what I'd like to do is jump over to just kind of a history of the Synoptic Gospels and how they were shaped according to what we're going to look at first is called source criticism. And source criticism works with like written documents where the writers got the materials from earlier documents than they had. So the source critics was the late part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. And it should remind you, if you've been in my class in Old Testament, of the JEDP theory. And we kind of debunked the JEDP theory in the class, trying to show some of the major problems with the JEDP theory that was developed by Wellhausen back in the 1800s. It's really defunct now, although it's assumed, I wouldn't say it's taught much anymore, but it's assumed by many critics if you were to go to the university. This source theory is different. It isn't, whereas the JEDP theory said Moses did not write the Pentateuch, this one is possible. And so this is a different, but it looks at the various sources. And so what the one source theory says is that basically there was one source, and it was the Evangelion, okay, the early gospel, and that all three writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three synoptic gospels, used this Evangelion, this early source. And so why are Matthew, Mark, and Luke so similar? They're so similar because they all drew on this early gospel record. It was an early record of what Jesus has said and done, and they all three of them borrowed from that when they wrote, and that's why there's similarities. This is called the one source theory. Now, the one source theory, you can see, explains the similarities. This explains why Matthew, Mark, and Luke are similar, but it does not explain the dissimilarities, why Matthew is different than Mark is different than Luke. So this was a one source theory, and some people propose that and things. Here's what's called the two source theory. Now, the two source theory, in this case, says there's Markan priority. Mark came first. And why is there similarities? Because Mark was used by Matthew, Mark was used by Luke. And by the way, does Luke tell us that he used sources? Luke tells us in Luke 1:1-4, we looked at that there were many accounts around and that he was going to talk to eyewitnesses and things. And that Luke was not with Jesus, had never met Jesus or seen Jesus. He was on the second missionary journey of the Apostle Paul. He became a Christian, so he didn't become a Christian until after the 50s A.D., and Jesus had been dead for 20 years. But Luke then does historical research, and one of those documents that he may have checked with, people suggest, is Mark, and that Luke used Mark. Matthew used Mark. I have a little trouble with Matthew using Mark, just when you think about it. Matthew was one of the 12. He was at the lectures that Jesus gave, the dialogues, the discourses that Jesus gave. And so to say that Matthew is dependent on Mark in a slavish way, that he's copying from Mark, Matthew was at these events himself, an eyewitness, whereas actually Mark was probably not at. Mark was from Jerusalem, so he would have seen Jesus in Jerusalem, but now the stuff that took place in Galilee, Matthew was there. And so, anyways, there's an interesting dance you got to do between Matthew and... Now, what's important with the two-source theory is this, what they call the Q document. The Q, or Quelle, the Quelle basically means source. I believe it's a German word. And basically the source. Now what the source document is, this is when Matthew and Luke share things that are not found in Mark. And if you remember that chart, that table that I put up, there were about 170 segments that Matthew and Luke shared together that are not found in Mark, in that Venn diagram kind of thing. So these would be that 170. They're found in Matthew, they're found in Luke, but they're not found in Mark. So then there was a special source for that. So they call this the two-source theory. And the Q, whenever you're reading about the Gospels, you read about Q, this is what Q is. Q is what Matthew and Luke share that's not found in Mark. And they call that the Q source, from the Q source. Now that's the two-source theory, and if you got a two-source theory, here's a fourth-source theory. And the fourth-source theory says, here's Matthew, and Matthew presents material that's unique to Matthew. Luke gives you material that's unique to Luke. There's about 500 segments that are unique to Luke. Okay, and then Q is still embedded here. A lot of people accept this Q, the Q source, the things that are found in Matthew and Luke, but not found in Mark. So Q still plays a role, but you've got Matthew with his unique material and Luke with his. This is called the four-source theory. A lot of people would have held this theory 1950s, 60s, and things. I think some people even today hold kind of the four-source theory, although this is kind of passé at this time a little bit, though some people will refer to Q, so you need to know what Q is, and Matthew, Luke, and that kind of thing. Now, that's called the source theory. The source theory said that there was basically these early sources, written sources that were used by Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Q and those things were actually written sources. Form criticism came in with Gunkel, and into the middle of the 20th century, form criticism came in. And form criticism focused instead of on a kind of a slavish copying of documents between documents, almost in a plagiaristic sense, although they would never say it like that, but that you're actually copying from documents. The form critics, they specialized in what's called oral transmission of information. And so they stress more the oralness of things. And when things happen orally, things change orally. And so you've got to be careful then with oral. They've done quite a bit with oral tradition. And documents, for example, I think it's in Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, where these bards, as they would say, these bards memorize songs of like 1,200 lines long, these long poems, these legends, these myths. They'll memorize them. And then these bards go from, alehouse to alehouse, recording and reciting these long poems that narrate the history of a country or legends or myths and that kind of thing. So oral tradition is really big. In our culture, we don't push the oral very much. Does anybody remember orally very much at all? And I remember even if you go back to Egyptian history, the Egyptians, when writing was first starting, I believe it was in Egypt, the Egyptians did not want their children to learn how to write because they said if they learn how to write, then they won't remember because they'll just write it down and they won't remember what we've told them. And so there was this conflict between writing and oral. And we even get that today somewhat between the written and the oral. So these people, the form critics, deal more with the oral and how oral legends come down and things. And so what happens is they schedule things into genres, different types of literature. When you're dealing with oral stuff, you need to set things up orally for your audience. So for example, if I said to you, once upon a time, immediately you're going to get a story that's what? Some sort of fable, some tale. You're going to get some tale. Once upon a time, there was a rich man, there was a poor man. You're going to get a story, once upon a time. And so those types of things, the once upon a time tells you. So there's different genres. There's different types of literature that is crafted orally. One of those would be pronouncement stories. Pronouncements of Jesus when he was in controversial settings. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Okay? And then Jesus goes off. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. You clean the outside of the cup, but the inside of the cup is all sorts of dirt and stuff in there, and you clean the outside of the cup. What good is it if the inside's dirty? And so these pronouncement stories of Jesus, setting up